welcome back to EH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and these are 5 artifacts that I no longer play. They're cards that were absolute Commander staples for me for a long time, either from the beginning of me playing the Commander format, or of course some of them came out just after I started playing the Commander format, but as soon as I saw them, they went in my decks and I used them in pretty much all of my decks in some of these cases, and I no longer really use them at all. So let's start out at number 5 with Mind Stone. 2 mana artifact, tap, add it colorless, pay 1 and tap, sacrifice Mind Stone, draw a card. So of course, everyone is very familiar with this in the Commander format. Just got reprinted in March of the Machines. Commander is currently in over 472,000 decks on EDHREC. That's a lot. That makes it one of the most popular mana rocks in the entire format. And I used to put this card in all of my monocolored decks for sure, right? It does add colorless mana, so you have to be careful there with the decks you put it in. I put it in all my monocolored decks and a lot of my 2-color decks as well, but I am currently not using it in any decks. It is a pretty good mana rock. It comes into play untapped. You can use it right away. A lot of people like that. And later in the game, when it's not very usable, you can sacrifice it to draw a card. Definitely, I think it's one of the better mana rocks in the format. But for me, I gotta be going pretty deep before I get to Mind Stone. For me, Ornithopter of Paradise and Liquimetal Torque are my go-tos for 2 mana rocks. I mean, obviously, Arcane Signet is going to be at the top of the list for everyone in the 2 mana rock slot. Might even put it at the top of the list for mana rocks in the entire format, really. It's 2 mana, gives you mana of any color, and comes into play untapped. So obviously, that's going to be the king of the mountain. After that, I go to Ornithopter of Paradise and Liquimetal Torque. I love both of those. Those are 2 of my favorite mana rocks in the entire format, and those are my second and third choices. It does depend a little bit on what I'm doing in the deck, but almost always I will go to those options first, and then I might go to Thought Vessel, and then after Thought Vessel, I might go to Mind Stone. That's how low down the list it is for me. And I'm not even talking about the Signet series and the Talisman series here as well, which in a 2-color deck are probably a better option. So I really do like Mind Stone. It is a good card for sure. It is nice that you can sacrifice it later in the game to draw a card. I think I've maybe done that 2 or 3 times in the entirety of me playing this card. I used to auto include this in all my monocolored decks, and I put it in a couple 2-color decks as well. I currently don't have it in any decks because there's just too many better options in the 2 mana value mana rock slot. All right, moving on to number 4, and it is the Immortal Sun. 6 mana legendary artifact. Players can't activate Planeswalker loyalty abilities. At the beginning of your draw step, draw an additional card. Spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and creatures you control get +1/+1. So much going on this card, right? It's drawing an extra card, your spells cost 1 less, you get an Anthem, and then the real reason why I started putting this in all of my decks is because players can't activate Planeswalker loyalty abilities. I think maybe they put this on that card to make it less of an option for people to play, right? Because a lot of people like Planeswalkers. So if you had Planeswalkers in your deck, you wouldn't go after this card, right? I did go after this card because of that ability. It is the only card out there, or at least it was at the time for sure, that was shutting down Planeswalkers. I don't like Planeswalkers, as a lot of people familiar with my channel know. And when I saw this card, I was like, oh man, there is a card that just completely shuts off Planeswalkers. And at the time when this card came out, I had just started playing Commander, and everybody was playing an Atraxa Super Friends deck. I ran into it almost every single day, and having a card in your deck that was colorless that could shut down Planeswalkers was fantastic. And then of course on top of that, draw an extra card. Your spells cost 1 less in the Anthem. So I immediately ran out and bought a few copies of this, started putting it in every deck that I could. And it certainly is a card that can fit in any deck, and it's going to do you lots of good. Of course, unless you're playing a lot of Planeswalkers in your deck. It is currently in almost 20,000 decks. That's not bad. I think it has fallen off in popularity a little bit. It is a bit of a good stuff card, right? Unless you actually care about that Planeswalker loyalty ability thing, which I have started to care less about. I don't see Planeswalkers that often. often. Certainly not enough to put this card in my deck. The rest of the stuff that is going on here is sort of good stuff. Giving your team an Anthem is okay. In some decks, it's better. Obviously, drawing an extra card is always good, although there are better options for that, I think, in pretty much every color. And of course, spells costing one less is always good, but it's one of those cards that I just could not justify keeping it in my decks. Other cards came out, I had to make room, and Immortal Sun is one of those cards that ended up not making the cut. So I currently have a couple of these sitting in my card box that I am not using. Coming in at number 3 is Mind's Eye, 5 mana artifact. Whenever an opponent draws a card, you may pay 1 if you do draw a card. I still think this is a pretty good colorless card draw option. It is currently in 26,000 decks on EDHREC. That's not bad for a colorless card draw option, but it has certainly fallen off. This was one of those cards that was very popular in the format when I first started playing. It was also pretty expensive, so the cost has certainly gone down for that reason. There just is so many other options now. Certainly if you were in a mono red, mono white, or Boros deck, this was probably your best option for drawing cards. It still is pretty good, right? Whenever an opponent draws a card, you get to pay 1 to draw a card. I like that. You know, Rhystic Study is a card that obviously is way better and played a lot more in the format. However, you're putting the power in the hands of your opponent. They can just pay the 1 and you don't get to draw anything. With Mind's Eye, you control whether or not you're going to draw. All you have to do is leave a few mana open, and on a turn cycle, you can end up drawing like 3 cards off of it. That's pretty good. And later in the game is where I really like it, and that's where you probably want to be drawing cards more, is later in the game. So you got an empty hand, you slap this down, and you can just start drawing like crazy every time your opponents do so. It's a pretty good draw option, just has fallen off for me because we've got so many better options in the format recently, obviously, right? I think that certainly is the case for a lot of people. This used to be a really popular card in the format and isn't so much anymore. Next up, Endless Atlas. That's right, 2 mana artifact. Pay 2 and tap, draw a card. Activate this ability only if you control 3 or more lands with the same name. So again, just like with Mind's Eye, this is a card that has completely fallen off for me. When I first saw it, I loved it. And one of the main reasons why I loved it is because it encourages players to play less colors, right? Because obviously, if you want 3 or more lands with the same name in the Commander format, those have to be basic lands, and you will almost assuredly be playing a monocolored deck. I don't know if people play this outside of a monocolored deck. In a 2-color deck, it doesn't seem very good. You're not going to be able to activate it until you have quite a few lands in play. Whereas in a monocolored deck, as soon as you got 3 lands, you can likely start using it. 2 mana draw card is pretty good. It is a pretty good card draw option in the format still. I see it is in over 30,000 decks. That's not bad. However, again, mostly it was those mono red, mono white decks, I would say. Certainly my mono white decks at the time, I think I had 3. I put this in all of them. I have like 4 copies of this card currently because I ran out and bought a bunch as soon as I saw it because I thought it was a great option. And those copies are all sitting in my card box once again because I have taken this card out of all of my decks. There's just way better options now, especially in mono white. I mean, mono white just has no need for this card at all, in my opinion. You just look at a card like Archivist of Ogma. There's a 2 mana card that is likely going to be drawing you a lot more cards than your Endless Atlas, and it's going to be doing it a lot quicker without having to use any mana. Again, though, I will say Endless Atlas is completely under your control, whereas with Archivist of Ogma, you have to rely on your opponent to search their library. That's usually not a huge issue, though. It is just not a card that I can find room for in my decks anymore because there are so many better card draw options. Coming in at number 1, though, is Worn Power Stone, 3 mana artifact. Worn Power Stone enters the battlefield tapped, and it taps to add 2 colorless. So obviously this has been a Commander staple since forever. It's been reprinted in like every Commander set, and it was an absolute go-to for me. It is currently in almost 70,000 decks on EDHREC, so it does still see quite a bit of play. It was an absolute staple for me in monocolored decks. Any monocolored decks I have, except for maybe the mono green one, I would put a Worn Power Stone in. It was an auto include because I thought it was a pretty good mana rock, especially after I stopped using Sol Ring. Worn Power Stone became the go-to for me. It's a little slow. It's a 3 mana rock that enters the battlefield tapped, but on turn 3, I play it and then I untap on turn 4, play a land, and I now have 6 mana on turn 4. That's pretty good, and that's when I can really start going to town, right? I like the way it curves out there with Worn Power Stone. However, again, we've just gotten so many great mana rocks in the format that Worn Power Stone has really fallen off for me to the point, again, where I am not using it at all. I probably have 12 copies of this card, all currently sitting in my card box, not getting used, and likely will never get used. I don't think I will ever use this card again. 3-mana rocks in general have fallen off in popularity in the format, right? Cards like Darksteel Ingot, Coalition Relic, again, cards that I used to play a lot and everyone used to play a lot, have really fallen off because we've just got so many great 2-mana options. And if I am willing to put a 3-mana value rock in my deck, I am likely gonna put one that is giving me some other value that I want. We have a lot of options there as well. A mana rock that is just adding mana in the 3-mana slot isn't good enough for one of my commander decks now. It's still pretty good. I certainly would not fault anyone for using it. It is sort of the fair version of a Soul Ring, which kind of goes to show you how busted a Soul Ring is. I mean, even a Mind Stone, which I talked about earlier in this list, I would probably put in my deck over Worn Power Stone at this point. Partially because the format has sped up quite a bit, I suppose, but also because we just have a lot of better options now that I can't really justify putting a Worn Power Stone in my deck. What do you guys think? Who out there is still using Worn Power Stone or any of these other cards? Certainly there's a lot of people, and they're all good cards. Again, these are specifically cards that I used to play all the time, and I would be shoehorning into my decks like crazy, and I don't play at all anymore. I just happened to be looking through my cards the other day, and I'm like, wow, I got a lot of Worn Power Stones in my collection because I used to play that card a whole lot, and I don't play it at all anymore. Let me know in the comments below if there's any artifacts out there that you guys used to play like crazy and don't play at all anymore. They're just sitting around collecting dust. That is it for today, though, and thanks for tuning in.